for those that are only listening to the audio, and I understand that you're probably in your car, hopefully driving nowhere because we're in the middle of a pandemic. Maybe you're not on YouTube. Maybe you can't see the video. So I'm going to describe it for those that can't see. Eric has in front of him not one, but two microphones. And that is because at Iron Culture, we take these controversies very seriously. We've dealt with, and honestly, a seemingly insurmountable amount. People have said that Iron Culture is going to need to shut down because it's one controversy after the next. And sometimes we say things that are supposedly erroneous, is what I'd say, allegedly, because I'm going to let Eric kind of answer for himself, because I strongly believe in my BFF, Sir Eric Helms. So Eric, last episode that we did a duo on, it was on cardio. A lot of minds were blown away how there's nuance to the topic, and it was great. But you kind of kept saying this group, this tribe of individuals, and you kept saying, I believe, Hazda, like Mazda, and I heard from many people that it actually is Hadza. And so it's a huge Hadza. And many people, I'm not saying that they lost confidence in you as a person, as a spiritual leader of the fitness community, as a paragon of moral virtue, but that is what they said. So I just want to give you, my man, the opportunity, because I owe you that much as co-owner of this great thing, for you to, to share your thoughts, my friend.
Well, I think like any good leader, you have to step up and absolve yourself of any responsibility for your actions. Yeah. That's something we've definitely seen in all the great leaders of our time, that you show yourself to be infallible, without the ability to be questioned, and that you never make mistakes. And that's how you get respect, make a real change, and you relate to the people. And by relate to the people, I mean they see you as a tyrant with an iron fist, and that's how stuff gets done. So I take no responsibility for my own actions of mispronouncing the name of the tribe. And I'm actually going to double down and say that I actually did say it properly. And this is a mismanagement of the internet. As the well-established proven fact is known, the toilets flush backwards in New Zealand and Australia. And this is not just an isolated effect. This is a proven scientific effect of the global magnetosphere, of the polarity shift, of the flux capacitors of the Earth. Those are all real things. Do not Google that. And it also tends to affect certain vowel combinations when transmitted digitally through the internet. So when you put a Z and a D next to each other, they tend to get reversed, much the way that the toilets flush the opposite direction here in New Zealand and Australia. So I want to reaffirm that I did pronounce it properly the whole time. And because I'm willing to fall on my sword for the greater good, I'm now going to pronounce it incorrectly so that it sounds correct to everyone else, which is a moral travesty in my own heart, because I would never disrespect this tribe. So for anyone who might be listening outside of my window, to my wife, who might be in another room, to my cats, who have quite acute hearing, as most felines do, when they hear me say it incorrectly and they lose faith in me, know that I'm making that sacrifice to the local people. And there are many people outside my window. That's just kind of the way it works when you're an unassailable leader. Right. To them, I just want to apologize. And to everyone else, I want to say shame on you for forcing me to do this. But you are welcome now that I'm going to pronounce the Hadza correctly. So I think we put that behind us. I think the people who've done the wrong thing know what they've done. And I judge them, and I'll never forgive them. And all I ask is that everyone do not judge me and forgive me without much critical thinking or thought behind that. Because I believe I've earned that as being a self-elected supreme leader without any official process. And with that moral authority that I feel entitled to for no good reason, I think we can move on.
Yeah, as the great, we draw inspiration from numerous great historical figures. Napoleon Bonaparte did say manifest destiny, so we're self-appointed in our divine destiny. So it has been foretold by us that we will in fact be the leaders. And I think, Eric, it's lovely because it has been said the most virtuous thing you can do is to put your own reputation on the line when you know you're doing the right thing. So it's one thing where it's morally prudent for an individual to sort of say something that they know will be well received. But when you know you're in the right, but you're willing to take that fall for the masses, that, my friend, is true virtue. And I just want to say, completely unrelated, but someone managed to track down the IP address locations of said individuals who even dared to attempt to correct you. Let's call it what it is, because I think you clearly explained what in fact happened. And weirdly enough, I haven't seen them post since that point in time. So I don't know what's happened. I heard that there was a 1D Lennon involved, but needless to say, Eric, that we won't be hearing from those voices either out of their own volition or, you know.
Yeah, all I have to say is that I really appreciate that we moved from a place of fear with Signal Nutrition and D. Lennon to a place of utility. You have a unique skill set. You know, I called him and I thought I was watching Taken because I was like, what am I hearing? He's talking about this unique set of skills. And the only thing, I'm like, wait a minute, that's not quite the right accent. This gentleman sounds like he's from Ireland.
Right.
This isn't Liam Neeson.
Yeah.
This is D. Lennon. And I said, Danny, you know, sometimes we get comments from the unfaithful, the doubting Thomases of the world. And we know the only way to address criticism, you know, as someone who is a rational skeptic and respects the value of all human life, is to make sure that all those who criticize are no longer able to criticize because they no longer have access to the internet, because they have access to nothing, because they've been killed. I mean, metaphorically. Metaphorically.
Spiritually,
it's an
we could
analogy.
almost even say. Yeah.
Spiritually.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, because they've been excised from their leader. So spiritually, they're
Correct.
dead.
Yes, they're excommunicated from life, from the cult.
Yeah. And
I mean, because you know what I'm saying.
Eric,
you understand.
Eric, I think if people can't understand, it's on them. And I'll just say in closing that, simply put, for those that have accused us of having a cult, I mean, it is called iron culture. And so it's kind of like when you say, hey, I'm a serial killer in a hypothetical scenario, and then you in fact do what you said you're going to do, and people are shocked. It's kind of on you, that cognitive dissonance where I told you, or someone told you explicitly what was about to happen, and then you're shocked at what happened. So with that being said, Eric, I do want to mention that for that episode, while there was that minor inconvenience that some people who no longer exist suffered, people thoroughly enjoyed the cardio episode, where they're surprised at the level of nuance that you were able to go into a seemingly understood topic. And we're hoping for a repeat, and hope is something people say that are modest. We're confident here. We're going to crush this shit. We're talking about rest intervals, and we're talking about a lot of different things. And there actually is a lot, Eric, because you put up a fantastic article. Let me shut my man out, okay? 3DMJ, the blog. If you're not checking it out, you should be. Eric wrote a banger. That's what people said. I'm just quoting them now. And that, in fact, is the truth. People, this guy right here. And there's
You're
actually...
a person.
Yeah. And there's a lot of nuance here where people will often ask the question, like, how long should I rest? Or what's the optimal rest time for an individual that is trying to pursue their goal? Well, what about in the context of trying to get stronger? What about in the context of trying to get bigger? We're going to talk about all that. We're going to talk about cardiometabolic fatigue. We're also going to talk about something that's almost mythical, and it's developed, I would say, almost, once again, a reactionary position. And that is, we're going to talk about the role, Eric, of localized fatigue and central fatigue. Where what does a powerlifter say, my man, when they do a set? And as you said, we're talking off air. It's like, Eric said, man, you ever have those days where it's like you have a great day and then you have bad days, and you're just like, my great days are the normal. It's like any powerlifter, like I experience that all the time, where you do a single, and the single, simply put, you overshot. You thought, in quotations, that shit was going to be an 8. It's much closer to a 9. And somehow to justify it, what do we say, Eric? Oh, man, my CNS. Like, bro, my CNS, it's shot. So there's a lot to talk about today. I am stoked. Yeah, it's Kentucky Fried Chicken. So I'm going to give you the floor, my friend. You addressed the controversy, and you battled back. It was weird. It's almost like the controversy emboldened you to reach new heights. And I just see you glistening up there, my friend. And it's no dream tan. That's just you.
No, that glistening is the sweat, because despite all of the time I've spent reading about rest intervals and reading about cardio, I realized that was time I could have spent doing cardio and being able to not rest so long to feel better. And I actually glisten just from moving my hands typing. That's how in poor shape I am. So ain't no interference effect happening here is all I got to say about that. So first, I want to give a first thank you to you for those kind words, and then I want to give a really big thank you to James Krieger, who's been on And he and I, we were talking about this at a conference in Norway. God, it would have been almost 3 years ago, maybe 4 years ago now. I can't remember which year it was. And it was around the time when he was starting to think about effective reps. How do we know what is the hypertrophy stimulus from a given set? We were starting to realize that around the time, like, it seemed pretty clear that hard sets was a decent way of counting volume specifically for hypertrophy. But there's got to be some point in which, hard sets are quantified as hard. And okay, if you do a set of 35 to failure, sure, it's as good as a set of 6 to failure, but there's got to be some way of looking at those 35 reps. Which one of them could you count similarly to the reps in 6, or is that even the way you do it, et cetera? And we were trying to, tease this out and just kind of rationalizing our way through it and discussing things. And he was like, some of the stuff on, rest pause or drop sets, or what often we use in kind of the more evidence-based community, if you're aware of Børge Fagerli's work, myoreps, and where you're purposely lowering your rest period and you're trying to train in a state of peripheral local fatigue, so that you can get higher muscle activation, because the motor unit, it's a threshold for activating higher threshold motor units is lower in a state of local fatigue. So it's kind of almost this, it's counter to what we've come to in the exercise science with regards to rest periods. Like, hey, we've got a fair amount of data where, you rest too short. That can actually impede, obviously, strength because you're fatigued and you can't lift as heavy. But also, almost paradoxically, if you think about it, hypertrophy. If you rest 1 minute versus 3 minutes and you're doing, let's say, a full body session a couple times a week, that might result in far less hypertrophy if you're doing a full body session and mostly compounds to failure. And that was actually shown in a study by Schoenfeld a few years back. So what is going on here if then we can turn around and say, hey, and by the way, you should do myo reps, only rest 30 seconds and get these little sets of 3 and sets of 4 and sets of 3 and sets of 4. How do we count that? How do we quantify it? How do we reconcile that difference? And that was a question we got on our YouTube channel at 3DMJ in response to one of our recent Q&As. And I thought, you know what? I need to write something about this, heavily influenced by James Krieger's work, and then also some other thoughts I've had about in the last few years. So big shout out to JK, and that's not a joke, because JK also stands for just kidding. It's not also his name. So
You're doing so well, Eric. You were crushing it, bro. I was looking at you just with pride as a friend. I'm like, my man, getting after it, setting it up to knock it out of the park. It's like you assumed almost the mountain. You're there, ascending, and then it's like, no, I don't want to be there.
And he slipped. Yeah. So, yeah. So I think depending on how engaged you are with the research on this, you might be going, hey, hold the phone, Eric. Did you say you're supposed to rest a long period for hypertrophy? So you may need, so the blog post was I kind of wrote about, we got to start at the beginning. What do we know about rest? Okay, then what do we understand about drop sets, supersets, rest pause, myoreps? And then why might there be this disparity? What are the nuances of these studies? And then what's our best hypothesis? So an interesting thing about science is that, we're essentially disproving things, right? That's kind of the basis of it. We can't effectively prove something very easily. Null hypothesis testing, you're testing the null hypothesis to see if it is accurate or not. So when you establish a hypothesis, which maybe eventually becomes a theory, you only need one robust finding that disproves it to say, yep, that actually doesn't fit the data. So if the hypothesis is short rest intervals impede hypertrophy, that's disproved immediately by any data on drop sets or rest pause showing that they can be just as effective or more effective. And then the question is, all right, how do we find a model that does fit the current data we have? So this is not like what we discussed when we get to this final kind of step of why we think that disparity can exist is not the definitive word. It just makes sense based on what we know. So we'll get there. This isn't the big T truth. And in fact, I think this is a good example of the way science is supposed to operate. It's not the new religion. It's not I don't like gurus anymore. Well, I do. The guru is named science. Yeah. If there's a study, then it is truth. It'll never change. In reality, it's kind of us, using that existential analogy that Mike T gave. It's our pen light in our knowledge in this moving cave. And then, every time we get a little more look at that cave, we go, oh, that's actually, that wasn't just a tunnel. That was actually just a concave piece. We went down the wrong path. Let's go back to where we were. Yeah. So yeah, there's a lot to unpack here. So Let me ask you,
Yeah.
Mr. Isuf, how has your perspective on rest intervals changed since you became a trainer way back over a decade ago to now?
Yeah, I will first just shout out that I think quickly, Eric, as I can't even count on my hand the times you haven't nailed something. So I mean, I feel that I'm just stating the obvious. But we're talking here, Karl Popper, falsification. The two different ones, the concept that either theories have been disproven or as of yet the theory has not been disproven. That lack of certainty, I think, in some people causes a sense of unease. Where it's like, what do you mean? Like, wait, this data, conflicting data, where I think people want, and we talk about this often, black and white answers. And how I'm going to tie it together, Eric, would be when I started off as a trainer, I actually think it was one of the signals from a marketing standpoint for a trainer to try and have authority would be to have a stopwatch. And I honestly, I am going to be honest when I say this, intuitively from playing sports and understanding a few things, like let's say sprinting, you do sprint practice. It's like, well, if you sprint, so let's say you do a 60-meter sprint, it's like if you go 30 seconds as opposed to 3 minutes later, there'll be, it's detrimental to your performance. You might be more out of breath if you decide to start 30 seconds instead of 3 minutes afterwards, but your performance will suffer. I noticed, however, at being a trainer that everyone had the stopwatch. I actually started being a trainer, Eric, around the time that people wore the stopwatch around their neck. There's all these subtle signaling things that people will do to, once again, I'm the trainer, I'm the man, I'm the only man, I'm the only one that possesses this knowledge, and they'll hold the thing in front of them, stopwatch, it's like, and go. Like I even for sets of 5, Eric, you know what I mean? Like, okay, you rested 84, 85, get ready to go. And go. And of course, I think that gives maybe also the trainee a sense of assurance, maybe false assurance, like, oh, wow, this individual knows what they're talking about. But then as I started experimenting with some of my own training, and I will give credit, I actually won't say who the author of the article is, not because he's super controversial, but he does fall in the realm of some pseudoscience, let's say, like where it's a mixed bag. But how he framed it, which was the truth, coaching athletes, he said, I don't carry around a stopwatch with me. He's talking about in the context of coaching athletes, and it brought me back to my sprinting days and that entire concept where it's like, are we trying to quantify things that are seemingly insignificant in the grand scheme, where it's like 90 seconds versus 100 seconds versus 110 seconds versus 120 seconds? How does this influence your performance? And I came back to a performance-driven mindset in 2012, I'd say quickly. So being a trainer a handful of years, I would say working with Sean Kelly at Fortis Fitness, where the simple thing that he said is rest as long as you need to so that your performance remains the same or improves. Let's say you're getting acclimated to the weights, but you don't want to rest. If we're doing just triples, like it's like, dog, we're doing triples today. It's like, yeah, rest. He would say 3 to 5 minutes. Like you're working up. It's like, but you can rest a little longer if you feel fresh. Because at the time, I was just getting in strength training, so I actually could afford, and I was, on occasion doing a little bit of aerobic activity. I was able to do it with not a lot of rest. And so that changed my perspective on things. And then actually a conversation, and it's not even a coincidence, with Alberto Nunez, fast forward then, where basically in a lot of my programs after that point, I would say the same idea. Rest as long as you need. Here's a general guideline. Understand for some people, rest a little less, rest a little bit more. When he came in 2017, I had a fantastic conversation with him in general about training because I loved his approach, not even his methodical approach, but his mindset when he was training. And I was just observing him. I'm observing, kind of the animal in the jungle there doing his thing. I'm like, oh, this is interesting. And he's in a Zen mode, Eric, when he lifts. He's not, once again, his phone not near him whatsoever. He's kind of just chilling, not looking up at the clock. Like, yep, guys, guess that's it was 64 seconds, time to go back down. And I just asked him, because I said in the context for hypertrophy, because I was more curious, 3 years ago then. And then he gave me his rationale. So there has been the change from I'm a trainer, I need to be taken in quotation seriously. What are some of those signals? Well, of course, you wear the tight polo shirt. Tuck it in. You got to tuck it into your pants. You probably have to wear black on black because it's just a look, Eric. You got to look basically like a jacked waiter of a fancy restaurant with a stopwatch around your neck. to thinking I want to get better. I don't know, like intuitively from my experiences in the past, like I don't know if resting a short period of time is superior in this context. And then with Alberta, when it came to the idea of maybe isolation movement, so kind of the hierarchy of exercises, the way it's being framed. Yeah, for squats, of course, you're going to rest as long as you need if you're once again trying to get stronger. We're doing tricep push downs and we want to accumulate a little bit localized fatigue. Yeah, we could shorten the rest interval. So it kind of being on a spectrum. That's been my journey thus far. And now I've come to the conclusion of just what I like to coin. Honestly, I don't know if it's original, but I call it UR, unlimited rest, which just means you don't do an exercise. You're on permanent. It's also known as permanent vacation. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a natural evolution, really.
Yeah.
And I mean, you're probably recovering harder than anyone else.
Yeah.
And so I think where you've gotten to is it's bold, it's logically intuitive, and it is the next step.
Thank you.
Now, on a serious note, you unpacked a lot of really, really cool stuff. And I think this highlights how there is a bi-directional nature of research. Now, what I mean by that is that the way I like to, when I teach like evidence-based practice and I talk to people about using research, I normally teach what I call the research chain. It's just something I coined, where we go from bench or basic or mechanistic research. This might be looking at, say, muscle protein synthesis in our context, or ENG data, or something of that regard, RER, like whether you're burning predominantly which substrate during exercise, etc. That can form a hypothesis that tells us about mechanisms. It tells us about the way things work. And then we go to applied research, also sometimes called translational research. For the specific reason it's called that is because you're supposed to translate it to practice. So it's application, applied research. And when I speak to trainers, I tell them you really should be focusing on applied or translational research. And in the absence of that, absolutely, you can check out an animal model, a short-term study on a mechanism, something that is in vitro rather than in vivo, like looking at a cell culture. But if we think about all of the tropes and all of the quote unquote bro science, a lot of it is not based in just what a big dude said. A lot of it is based in old data or incomplete data and then extrapolating too far, So like if you think about the fascia related stuff, when I got really excited about that 10 years ago, it's sort of a very limited data set on fascia, or extrapolating when we look at cadavers, or getting really excited about EMG, or getting really excited about muscle protein synthesis, and then finding, oh, wait a minute, some of that is contributing to muscle damage repair, and it might be related to doing an exercise that you're not used to, and accelerated levels of muscle damage from something you're not familiar with. And in some cases, it doesn't actually correlate with hypertrophy. Or in the case of rest periods, which we'll come back to, growth hormone goes up in response to high volume, short rest interval training. Growth hormone is related to growth, so therefore we need to maximize growth hormone. And that's jumping a step, essentially, in the research chain. It's saying, well, hold on. You did a study just looking at the acute response of growth hormone. Maybe we should see if long-term that plays a causational role. We could match volume and then just change the protocols so that the only difference is that one elicits a growth hormone response, the other one doesn't. And you can indirectly do that with rest periods. Anyway, that's just one example. But the bidirectional nature is really important, because in an applied field, even our mechanistic stuff is meant to inform applied stuff, because we're trying to change the practice of athletes or coaches or trainers, right? So a lot of what is studied, like we had Dr. Bill Campbell on, when he actually establishes what is his research question, one of the first things he does is he sits down with coaches in the area of physique development and says, hey, what have you guys found anecdotally that seems to work pretty well? And he talks to, science-minded coaches who take meticulous notes and track their data, change one thing at a time. So these are high-quality anecdotes. And they go, okay, that's an interesting thing. Let's see what's going on there. Are you chasing a placebo effect, or are you actually seeing something real? And then does it work the way you think it does, or maybe it just improves adherence, not physiology, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the bidirectional nature. So anyway, that's really interesting to me, because where you got just from observation and over time and thinking logically and your experience as a trainer is largely where we went over time with research, which basically tells you research is pointless and just do whatever the hell you want and makes sense. No, I'm just kidding. But sometimes research can serve to confuse. I think the false concept of bro science being from bros and the evidence-based community having it quote unquote right needs to be done away with, because many of the things, like I said, that are considered the tropes of today were quote unquote hard science of yesterday, or people acting in the absence of good data and using what was available. Like the peri-workout stuff, that came out of the scientific community, the statement that it's really important to have protein after your workout. And some articles would even say it's more important than your total protein intake over the course of the day. That's probably not true, but that's a reasonable assumption if all you have is peri-workout acute bench or mechanistic style research that shows elevated muscle protein synthesis instead of having an applied study, if that makes sense. So we need to understand that we shouldn't make strong conclusions until we have strong evidence. It's that simple. And the time course of the rest period data basically follows us making an error in the scientific community and going down what we thought was a tunnel in the cave, and it ended up being just a little concave period where, that's just actually a wall, and we had to come back. So what I'm specifically talking about is that growth hormone data, and I think that's where the root of the protocols came from. So I don't know about you, but when I first got my first personal training certification was in 2005. It was via ISSA, and then I got ACE after that in NASM. I don't remember which one, but I do remember either one of them or maybe my undergraduate, it might have been my original NASM textbook, but in its hypertrophy blocks, the OPT model from back in the day, do like, what is it? Stability something, and then you do like strength endurance, and you do hypertrophy, and then you do max strength and power.
Yep.
Right? It's like kind of a block periodized model. Nothing wrong with that at all, by the way. But I remember in the hypertrophy phase, you're supposed to restrict your rest intervals. And that's in a textbook. Did you experience that when you did your stuff? Was that a time point in your personal trainer education?
Yeah, so I did the KFit Pro and the CPTN, and I'm trying to remember back to it because I was that cocky asshole. Not surprising, Eric. That so it takes just one data point for me to call into question your entire authority. Where the educator, we actually went out on the floor on day one, and she was just explaining how for bench you don't want to go with elbows past 9 degrees. I'm like, all right, I'm done here, guys. So I passed it. What's fine. I do remember though, what you said basically, it's like a block periodization, and then they manipulate some of the variables. And when it comes time to hypertrophy, what's one of the things you have to do? You have to start shortening the rest intervals.
Yep. Yeah. So the original recommendation for that actually came from data out of the 80s and 90s, where they saw that if you did a high volume of work that used a lot of muscle mass and you restricted your rest intervals, you would get the highest spike in growth hormone. Now, that immediately makes a lot of sense. If you think of growth hormone the way someone who's never been exposed to endocrinology thinks of it, like, growth hormone, that must be the hormone that makes me grow. And it does, like growth hormone, don't get me wrong, like especially during like maturation, that's a huge part of growth. And it does have some role in impacting growth, but it doesn't just do that. Growth hormone is a huge like energy metabolism regulator. It affects substrate utilization. And it's no surprise that the production of GH is enhanced under acidic conditions. So in a state where your muscles are doing a lot of work, you see a better binding at the site it's produced and higher growth hormone levels. And the correlation between blood lactate and growth hormone is almost perfect. It's like 0.9 plus correlations. So when you think about it in that way, okay, I'm expending a lot of energy. I need to pay for that. I have to provide that energy. And then you think, lactate response and growth hormone are totally matched. Maybe this has to do with, having energy metabolism issues rather than this just being a side effect. Now, as we also saw that we talked about it, volume has something to do with hypertrophy. So the amount of work you do requires energy, and the amount of work you do, if it's of a sufficient tension and the right type, can induce hypertrophy. So yes, growth hormone and training volume are correlated. But there's a lot of ways to create an immediate and huge energy sink. And one of them is to do compound lifts with moderate rep ranges to the heaviest load you can do to failure in short rest intervals, right? And that became the basis for our recommendations for hypertrophy. But this is one of those cases where correlation was missed for causation. So, as an example of when this starts to fall apart, and we see that correlation doesn't have utility in certain cases. There's a study where they had runners performing 30-second sprints, right? And they looked at the growth hormone response, which of course correlated like 0.9 with lactate. And as you would expect, it went up really high, and then if you compare that to other studies where they have a full 5x5 to failure workout session of compound lifts. So like you came in and you're like, sweet, I'm going to do a bench, a row, an overhead press, a squat, and a deadlift. And if I didn't already say a row or a lat pull down, whichever one I didn't say that too. So like 6 compound movements, 5x5 to failure, that whole workout produces a lower growth hormone response than one 30-second sprint. So now, do we actually think that a 30-second sprint is better than a full body 5x5 for hypertrophy? I don't know anyone who would say yes. And this is an example of it just having to do with the restricted rest interval. Because that 5x5 session I was talking about, 3-minute rest intervals between sets. So if you create this demand for immediate energy at a high level, yeah, you're going to see the body do what it needs to do to provide that. But that's not the same as saying that the volume, somewhat independently of how that energy demand is met, predicts hypertrophy. And this is where it started to fall apart. And this is where in more recent years, we've seen that when you start to go below, say, 60 seconds of rest, you can see impediments to hypertrophy, especially in certain designs, depending on what they're doing. Like I kind of spoiled the plot earlier. I mentioned that Schoenfeld and colleagues did a study where they compared 3-minute rest versus 1-minute rest on a 3-day per week full body workout. And that full body session was also equally hard. They had basically squat, I think leg press, overhead press, bench, row, maybe lat pull down. So it was, a lot of compound movements. And again, to failure in that hypertrophy interval range. And they saw substantially better hypertrophy in the group that rested 3 minutes, which directly tips on its head that one column in your textbook. It's like, yeah, do 3 sets, 8 to 12, rest 60 seconds. Oh, that didn't work, So what is going on there? And we had a very reasonable explanation for what that was once we started to see, what's actually happening is not the growth hormone response, but what the growth hormone is related to, which is high volume. But you can get high volume with low rest periods and therefore less of a lactate response and also less of a growth hormone response. Okay, so it's volume. Okay, so when I rest 1 minute, as you very astutely observed as a trainer, it's harder to perform after my next set because I'm tired and I can't do as many reps or I have to drop the load. So if you were to do, 3 sets to failure with a given load and you're supposed to stay in the 8 to 12 rep range, as an example, that's the way most of these studies are designed, you have to drop the load. So that means your load is going down. So ostensibly the tension is lower. Or if you decide to maintain load, the reps go down. So either way you dice it, either volume load is going down or reps is going down or the load itself is going down. And that was the explanation we had and that I was cool with even for just a couple of years ago. Like, yeah, you don't rest enough, volume goes down, you're done. And I thought that was case closed, that simple. And then stuff got complicated. Then, Stronger by Science comes out and they've got a publication saying it's just a number of hard sets. And I think immediately, I didn't think anything of it. Like, that makes sense too. Yeah, because, a set of 20, a set of 6, in the end, you get to the same place if you go to failure. But if we really think about it, like hold on, that's a whole lot more volume load if you're doing 30 versus 5. And if it doesn't matter if you do 5 versus 30, so long as it's sufficiently hard, then it shouldn't matter how much you rest. If you're doing sets of 8 to 12 and it drops down to sets of 6 to 10 because of fatigue, that should be just as effective. So what is going on there? And that's essentially where the impasse came, and now where we feel like we have conflicting data that doesn't fit that model.
The Gordian knot. And as we know from Alexander the Great, you just got to chop that thing in half. Eric, quick aside, here's a question for you. Just in terms of trying to keep up to date and just the role of science and trying to move the ball forward. You kind of stated that essentially for individuals wishing we want those need explanations. And I think also there's the novelty and also the authority. People want to stake a claim somewhere. They want to also conceptualize something that's easy to understand and definitive. I actually see this in the comment section all the time. And I think this is almost honestly just a little bit of human nature. When I had the good doctor, you just mentioned Brad Schoenfeld. Rosenfeld, when I had him on in New York, and I sat him down and we're talking, he said often, I ask a question, context, it depends. And people are like, man, this is the thing I hate about these scientists. They always say it depends. I'm like, you don't want them to have request essentially context before giving an answer. Do you think essentially when it comes to some of these situations that it's the need to be seen, I don't know if it's as an authority figure or to differentiate yourself? Like basically, my question for you is, why do you think it happens where people will tend to develop almost these slightly layered assumptions? So you have a certain data set, it's incomplete, you can't really make definitive conclusions, yet people will kind of run with it in some sort of context, come up with their own modeling or whatever plausible explanation. Why do you think that happens? And why do you think for a large swath of people, we kind of have to then go back retroactively, take a look at it, think, oh, okay, here's where we went wrong? Just quick aside before we continue.
That's actually a great tie-in to our kind of joking intro about how I defended my pronunciation and I would take no responsibility. Yeah. I mean, even though we have reached a period where we are ostensibly on board with using science in the fitness community, I don't think the underlying philosophy of what science is built on has been carried forward as well. Like back when I got into the game, the quote-unquote evidence-based community had a lot of leaders who were basically just anti-gurus, jerks, who wanted to be the smartest guy in the room and would just, they got really good at shitting on you with PubMed links, arguing about the details of studies, and proving that they were the best at knowing stuff and explaining things and thinking of gotchas. Now, the upside of that is that if your guru and your ego is completely based on being right and interpreting data and being a rational skeptic, that won't allow you to get into a complete hole like someone who is, I am the evidence, I'm right, my ego is based on my own self-fulfillment. It's kind of a circuitous pathway. I'm using research to be the guru rather than I'm the guru, therefore what I say is equivalent or better than research. There is some level of protection, but unfortunately, it is built on the same crappy philosophy that gurus use of eventually the goal is to get to the point where I'm the man on the mountain who you come see. And, my crystal ball is PubMed rather than just whatever's inside of me. So the underlying philosophy of science is, the scientific method is built on understanding that we don't know everything. We can't know everything. The whole nature of statistics is probabilistic. It doesn't provide rigid answers, but I think there's two things going on. We're carrying forward that really kind of, I'm going to say toxic, even though that's an eye roll word. That kind of like toxic underlying philosophy of so long as you're right and you're the man or woman or often the man though when we talk about this era, and you're the guru on the hill. It's great, but you just have to use science. Like you can be a complete jerk. You can crap on other people. You can, so long as you use science to do it, that's all good because that's the only thing that's left. Except that's inherently unscientific. When you don't use the principle of charity, when you use science like a stick and beat other people with it, you're actually using ad hominem attacks. You're positioning yourself as smart, them as dumb, and then everyone who looks onward is more likely to assess your interpretation of the data as better. So it can sustain a lack of knowledge on your part or a poor interpretation, so long as it doesn't require you to hold such cognitive dissonance that you're at odds with most of the data. You can go along being wrong and supporting it with a handful of studies or an odd interpretation of them fit your biases, or not even fit your biases. Just went back to that one time someone called you out on Facebook and you dug your heels in because you want to be right in front of your followers, that kind of thing. And you see that all the time. So the issue is that we're still using that same model of how do I become an authority in the fitness community? It's by being a guru, and I need to use science. And that's actually been around forever. If we go back to science as a marketing tool, which we've talked so much about, I'm not going to keep going down that pathway. So that's part of it. I think the other part of it is that the people in the evidence-based community are largely analytical thinkers who like to know answers. They probably err on the side of over obsessing about things. And these are generally people who do well at math, But statistics is a branch of math that doesn't give you specific answers. It's not 2 + 2 = 4. It's, hey, at a p-value of 0.03, meaning if we had a sufficient sample size to detect a moderate effect, we think there's only a 3% chance of this happening randomly. But expressed another way, we have a 95% chance that our mean represents the true mean that comes from the population we sampled, assuming we actually did randomly sample it and do random allocation, and there wasn't a covariate we didn't think of and didn't control for. So it's an inherently probabilistic statement. And when you bring in things like publication bias, when you bring in things like low sample size studies, because you didn't actually meet that, because we can never recruit that many bodybuilders or fitness enthusiasts, etc. Man, you have to wait until you've got 5 or 6 studies on something. And I think if you take that guru model, what you always see is someone who has the answer. And when people are frustrated and they're trying to reach their goals, they don't want someone to provide them wishy-washy likelihoods, potentials, it depends. They want you, and because they believe it to be true, because this is the way the fitness industry has trained them, whether you use science or not, that, hey, I have this specific thing. Here's the one thing you missed. This thing that you thought was true, it's actually the opposite. There was a conspiracy theory. No, you actually need this supplement. Doctors hate him, etc., etc., etc. This trick will get you something in 12 weeks. We're always waiting for that one magic thing, even when we know better. I do this too, to tell us, oh, the grass is not only greener on the other side, but it's green because it's layered with money. And then that money is going to also, I move it out of the way, and oh my God, my 6-pack, and I have the world, and everything's great. So people people sometimes learn the person who's going to help me is the one who has specific definitive answers. I've also learned science is important. So the person who gives me a scientific definitive answer, that's the one who shows a lot of confidence and bluster and is the guru, but uses #science. And I think that's what people look for. And I think that's sometimes what we get rewarded to do, even in the evidence-based community. So I think that's why we spend probably just as much, if not more time talking about the underlying philosophy of what science should be, rather than just scientific studies. Because I think great quote that is attributed to Einstein. A college education, the value is not in accumulating knowledge, but teaching you to think. And that's hopefully what we're trying to get to. So anyway, that's my super long-winded answer to why you think we get in these positions in the first place.
Eric, we just had a YouTube moment, my friend, where I think that should be clipped and it should be posted on your Instagram. And I'm saying this live during the podcast because I think we have successfully defeated essentially #science, and we're putting up instead of it #cult, because let's say you can't kill something without replacing it with something else. We know this. This is how revolutionaries work. Now, I will say that what you noted and what you were saying right there, it actually is kind of sad that oftentimes you become that which you hate, in that you've seen this critiques, let's say, of gurus, and then inevitably the individual starts following the same pattern where it's almost the mechanisms of trying to stay at the top, or let's say, Eric, I'm joking when I say this, like when we joked and said critiques of capitalism, like critiques of various things, like you want to keep appealing to people, you want to keep having the reach, that idea of being right rather than helping people. And I think that's an important distinction, where sometimes, and what you noted before, let's just say like 10 years ago by the early evidence-based crew, where it almost was entering a conversation as a debate, which means that there must be a winner and a loser. It's a zero-sum game. Who's going to win? Like, we just entered a conflict. Who's going to win between me and you? Instead of a conversation where there's almost that synthesis of ideas or an understanding or some sort of point where there's
Let's
a bridge.
figure this shit out.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And not let's see who's the equivalent of a boxing match with PubMed.
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah, and I think sometimes we're baying for blood, like from Roman gladiatorial times, where you want to see your avatar in the online space. Like, yeah, like he slayed that guru. I'm like, really? It's like, is this helping people though? It's like, as you said, Eric, someone you actually know, my buddy Roop, he said this real quick because he's all the way into the maths, his brother, and all those things, where he said that some of the individuals, this isn't a knock against Neil deGrasse Tyson at all, like getting the interest in science and all those things. But he said, I genuinely wonder the individuals that go and see him, if we were just to take a split between those that have seen him, the same education level, those that follow him, like, yeah, #science, and those that don't follow him but have a similar education level. If we're just to quiz them on the basics, some critical thinking, or like how we come to our conclusions, has all this experience of following a guru actually enhanced your ability to think critically? And he was just talking openly about it. And I actually thought it was a very good point. And that is why, as you said, Eric, respect to you, my man, with Iron Culture, that we try and reframe the way people look at things. And that's why it's like, dog, like, why are you talking so much about the philosophy things? It's like, because it kind of matters. It kind of is the underpinning of everything. And which is why, we gel, which is why we were holding hands metaphorically when we watched, I'm going to say it, Hereditary. And that is why I wanted to go down just that.
Wait, that was metaphorical?
No, I mean,
whose hand was I holding?
There was a connection of some sort. And, I think that is why, in ways, we really do connect. And that is why, when you're mentioning this, you actually have been on the scene, essentially, because it is with the rise of internet culture since kind of the inception. So you've seen kind of that guruism. You've seen the rise of the evidence-based crew, the evolution of thought, which brings us back to the topic, Eric, of kind of we're at this impasse now. So we're circa, what would this be, 2016-ish, you're talking about, where it's seemingly conflicting information. How does someone that wants to, worship at the altar of Swole, how do you make sense of this when you want the answer?
Yep, exactly. So this is one of those times where data starts to emerge where we're like, oh, okay, hard sets. Right. And I to give credit to some of the people who've commented and thought about this wasn't obviously apparent to me. Changing from volume load or total reps to hard sets, I thought, oh, sweet, easy heuristic. That makes a lot of sense for hypertrophy. And then someone's like, well, hold on, then why do short rest periods cause problems? If I went from 12 to 6 reps, that shouldn't be an issue. And my response was, because I didn't, it was not obvious to me. And it's something we're still trying to reason our way through. And that led to that conversation with Krieger in Norway. So I'm actually fortunate that the conversation around effective reps started to come in, because this is basically trying to explain why you can count hard sets. That essentially with really heavy loads, you start with pretty much recruiting and providing a high level of attention to everything, and you eventually get there with a low load set. So probably the strict, and I would say another theory that kind of didn't hold up, because some data on training to failure does not show training to failure being better, is that the last basically 5 reps of any set are what really get the job done. But that doesn't hold up either. So it is a little more complex than that. But I do think it is a useful model to understand that as you go through a moderate or high rep set, the reps become increasingly effective. Because you have generated enough fatigue that other fibers have failed, and that now the high threshold motor units, which recruit the larger type 2 fibers, which are normally not recruited with light loads, are coming in and they're training and getting fatigued. And essentially, you take a more circuitous route to get to the same place that you would with a heavy load. And I think we just don't have the granularity to use that effective reps model to say that's true. But it does then say the question, well, hold on, with a myo rep set, I'm doing that first activation set near to failure, so that every set of 3 to 4 or 5 or 6 that I get afterwards, all those reps quote unquote count, even though they normally wouldn't if I was to rest 3 minutes. And so the same reason that that's effective can't be the same reason that resting too short is ineffective. So what the heck is going on, right? So that was not apparently obvious to me. And I think it all depends in how you set things up. So there's a few things we do in the bodybuilding community. We'll do drop sets for those who aren't familiar. If you're just all about that strength, you might say take a heavy load and then running the rack on lateral raises, for example. You do your 12 rep max, you drop down 25%, you do it reps to failure. You do that a couple more times and you get done really, really quick. I think the old model would be, that's ineffective. Your load dropped too much. You're dropping off reps. And I don't know that was true back in the day, but I would advise against these techniques because it was really difficult to track volume, to track progress, and to see how do you compare that to other sessions. I didn't like those quote unquote intensity techniques primarily from a tracking perspective. But then some research came out showing that, this stuff actually works. And this is where I think we had to really think, how does this work? So there was a study by Zaki and colleagues that came out, I think, just a couple years ago. And they basically took one group doing curls with 3x6 at 80% of 1RM. And another group did one set to failure. And then they would rest 30 seconds and do multiple sets to failure until they got 18 reps. So that at the end, both groups did the same thing. One did 3x6 at 80%, and another group did 18 reps at 80%. But that first set was to failure. And lo and behold, it wasn't even equivalent hypertrophy. The hypertrophy was actually better in the group that did the drop sets. So, or rather, I should say the rest pause sets. So the interesting thing here is, actually, no, Ozaki was the drop set. But anyway, so I'm going to talk about these two studies. So we got Ozaki, which did drop sets. And they compared a group that actually started at 80% and then another group that dropped down from 80% to 65 to 50 to I think to even lower than that. And then there was also a rest pause set study that had equivalent results similarly, and they did the 3x6 versus one set to failure and then following on. Now, the reason why these seem to be both effective is they're manipulating the proximity to failure. So 6 reps at 80% of 1RM is probably for most people a load they could do 8 to 12 reps with. So that means you're anywhere between 2 to 6 repetitions in reserve. So that is probably not going to be as effective as a 1 set to failure in a vacuum at 80%. So right there, we're seeing that the group that did 80% to failure is getting a higher stimulus acutely. Then they're doing just basically myo reps. They're resting 30 seconds and doing clusters until they reach 18 reps. The group that is resting 3 minutes between and doing 6, 6, 6, they're going to accumulate some fatigue, but they're probably only getting close to failure on that last set. So you've done the same volume, you've done the same load, but we've seen a closer proximity to failure. So that probably explains why this works out when you do rest pause in that nature. But that seems to conflict with what about just resting 1 minute between sets? Like, shouldn't all those sets be effective because of the prior fatigue? So then this is where that research chain is important. So we've gone up the chain from mechanistic to applied. Now we got to go back down. So what the heck is the mechanism here? Because it's clearly not just volume. You both did 18 reps with 80%. What's going on here? So this is where we can now go back down and start looking at what I would call, bench research or basic research or mechanistic research and see what is going on here exactly. And now we go back to, I mentioned earlier, muscle protein synthesis. So this is an acute marker where we have someone in a study that lasts hours. They do a training program and we look at the deposition of protein into the muscle post-training. And there was a study where they had folks do leg extensions and leg press with 1 minute rest intervals compared to a longer rest interval. And they found the group that did all these sets to failure with only 1 minute rest intervals had markedly suppressed rates of muscle protein synthesis acutely, and also some of the anabolic pathways that stimulate hypertrophy downstream were also suppressed. So something is going on here. Now, what's going on, that study doesn't tell us directly. We just know there's something inherently problematic, at least in that design, using leg extensions and leg press and only 1 minute rest interval with like stimulating hypertrophy. Now, there's other research out there where they've looked at the nature of fatigue. And I think that's what we get to eventually, is a drop set study on bicep curls the same as doing 1 minute rest intervals on leg press, a compound movement, or that study by Schoenfeld where they did like 6 movements together in the same session. And when we start to look at the data, it seems to be a trend that when we see short rest intervals pan out equally, or when we see something like a drop set or a rest pause set perform better than a longer rest interval, we start to see a consistent trend that they're using more isolation movements. So what the heck's going on here? Well, we know isolation movements don't train the same amount of muscle mass, so maybe that has something to do with it. So there was a study where they compared doing single leg extensions to dual leg extensions, and they looked at basically what you would call peripheral versus central fatigue. So how much? So it's basically not how much do you fatigue, but why do you fatigue? Now, here's the funny thing. So we're going to go back to CNS being fried that powerlifters often say. Our perception, and when we say CNS fatigue, is probably different than what is actually going on. That feeling of being just kind of dead after a hard session for multiple days probably has more to do with other factors than actually central factors. Now, I am not a fatigue researcher, so take this with a grain of salt. This is my understanding from reading these studies. So the exact process of doing it is not something I've had hands-on, but I've read these method sections and I understand what's going on. The way we actually measure central fatigue in a lab is by doing an evoked electrically stimulated contraction on top of a voluntary contraction. So essentially, someone would do a leg extension. You stimulate the muscle, and you see if the the electrically evoked contraction on top of the normal contraction produces more force. So let's say you're on an isokinetic dynamometer, you're pushing as hard as you can against the pad with your quadricep. We do an evoked contraction. If force output jumps up, that means there's a difference between what can be sent by the centrally versus what you're putting out, and that deficit is what we would define as central fatigue. Right? Now, if there's no difference, then you haven't induced central fatigue, right? So that essentially is something that, interestingly enough, when you test that phenomenon and you make it happen, it lasts hours, not days. Our perception in the community when we talk about central fatigue and local fatigue, we think of basically, it's lactic acid or my CNS being fried. Neither one of those is true. It's not lactic acid. We see blood lactate go up, and that tends to correlate with acidic conditions, and some of those other metabolites are probably related to fatigue, but lactate itself is actually more of a fuel than anything else, rather than what's actually inducing fatigue. So no, that short-term issues you're dealing with is the energy deprivation right now, and probably more related to central fatigue. The long-term stuff is more related to muscle damage, and probably maybe what's known as low-frequency fatigue, which lasts a couple of days, which kind of gives you this general feeling of weakness, because some of your postural support muscles are having to work harder than they normally would just to walk around, like the heavy dead legs that we experience. So we're observing something that's actually happening. It's true, but our descriptions are almost backwards. Right? So CNS fatigue, or what's probably more appropriately termed central fatigue, is a phenomenon that acts very quickly and very short and goes away. And ironically, the things that trigger it are high amounts of local fatigue. So it's associated with super high levels of blood lactate, which again is not the issue, it's not the cause, but it's associated with having done a lot of work, generating a lot of metabolites, acidic conditions, metabolites building up, and peripheral fatigue. So when you dump a whole bunch of cardiometabolic fatigue on somebody, that normally triggers a central governor, which is the theory of understanding where central fatigue comes from. And it goes, whoa, I need you to slow down, put force, less force, burn fewer calories, have less of an energy demand because you're doing a lot right now. And then if you can rest enough, let that recover, that'll come back. So we've kind of established, okay, there's different ways which we can experience fatigue. And what matters though? So clearly, central fatigue is something that we don't want if we're trying to lift the heaviest load, right? Yeah. That makes sense. It makes you have less of the ability to put out force. And if you're trying to lift the heaviest load, peripheral fatigue is also not something you want. For whatever reason, I don't want my muscle to be able to lift less. If my pure goal is strength, the answer is pretty much always the same. Lift when you're ready, which I think is where that performance mindset that you experienced as a trainer got from just being out there. Like, no, I don't have a wristwatch. The whole reason we're timing my rest periods because I read in a book it takes me 3 minutes to recover. Why don't I just wait till I feel recovered? And in fact, there are data to suggest that auto-regulated rest periods are just as good, arguably better, because you're going when you feel ready, not when a textbook says on average you should feel ready to perform. So from a pure performance perspective, central fatigue, peripheral fatigue, at least in the short term, doesn't matter. You try to set things up so that you can perform as best as you can, and that will improve performance for the most part, except for like an overreaching phase. For hypertrophy, though, the story is a little different. So when we're chasing those hypertrophies, as you like to say, there is basically a good fatigue and a bad fatigue. The whole reason a 25 rep set can be effective as a heavy set of 6 is because of peripheral fatigue. If we can generate those local fatigued conditions in a muscle, it lowers the threshold for high threshold motor unit recruitment. It allows us to tap into those fibers that normally require heavy or high velocity movements. And boom, that peripheral fatigue has facilitated us training all of the muscle fibers and inducing a hypertrophic stimulus. But central fatigue is essentially just turning off the lights. We're saying, no, we're not going to recruit those muscles. That is what we don't want. So generating a whole lot of cardiometabolic stress is the hypothesis we have, the current working theory as to why sometimes rest periods that are short can be facilitative, or sometimes why rest periods that are short can be debilitative depending on what you're doing. So yeah, 5 sets of leg press to failure with 1-minute rest intervals. Go ahead and try that and feel like you're not going to throw up or that you're not out of breath. Now, you can improve your cardiovascular endurance to where that can become more effective over time. And there's actually data to support that, where it does reduce maybe what we think is that central fatigue. But on the whole, if you can think about what is logical, like you were talking about earlier, just that you got to by common sense, yeah, if I'm going to do sets of squats, I'm going to leave a few in the tank. I'm going to rest as long as I need because I need to be able to perform. But yeah, bicep curls, lateral raises, take it to the house, because how much total fatigue is there going to be? And indeed, that's what the data supports. Things like drop sets, things like short rest period studies, when they pan out, or when they pan out just as well, or even actually exceed the performance or the hypertrophy seen in longer rest period studies, it's when they're dominated by single joint movements and less fatiguing movements. And then you can actually say that the research design is biased towards the group that is doing shorter rest intervals, because they're actually training in the state of higher peripheral fatigue and higher motor unit activation, and pushing those fibers in a local sense closer to failure and getting a greater stimulus, if that makes sense.
Eric, put it on the damn clinic. I think what's interesting about this is that sometimes it might be seemingly counterintuitive, that which would be best for you. And I think I can say that, maybe in the lifting community, there's a little bit of that masochism where you want to suffer because, as you know, if you suffer more, bro, you're putting in the work. If you are suffering, it means that you're closer to attaining your goal. Because once again, let's set up 2 scenarios right here. You just gave a great example of the leg press. 5 sets, 1-minute rest interval training to failure. It's like you're going to be out of breath. You're going to be feeling like shit by the end of it. You're going to be sweating up a storm, puking, maybe yelling, all those things where you're really exerting yourself. How hard did you work? Real hard, right? Or you take the person in the squat rack that's maybe doing sets of squats, resting, leaving, going to RP8, 2 in the tank, resting about 3 to 5 minutes. It's like, to that bodybuilding bro who is training in quotations harder, meaning, not only proximity to failure, but just overall, the fatigue that they're accumulating. Why, of course, the guy getting after it on the leg press, it's like, well, wait a second, we need the context here. And I think when you use the analogy of who's in the driver's seat, or like, what are we trying to do here? Or when can we go to failure, or how long should we rest, or all these things. The idea of, your isolation movements, well, you just think about it intuitively. It's like, okay, I'm doing a bicep curl. It's 105 pounds. I could go go balls to the wall, clean house, reach that failure. I could rest, 90 seconds, and I could go ahead. And by the end of it, I feel great. Let me replicate this now with a compound movement. So let me ask you then, Eric, you spoke in the context of for a bodybuilder, and then as someone that cares about performance, and then you mentioned obviously the fatigue debt, maybe to put it one way, of compound movements versus something like an isolated movement. In the larger context then of someone's training, how then would they best go about achieving that synthesis when it comes to rest intervals and all those other variables to achieve said goal? And let's assume, once again, I gave that example of Mike's orders because I honestly think it does genuinely describe everyone. Even if you think you're a power lifter, and I joke when I say that, it's like, you mean you don't want to win the hypertrophies? Like, you wouldn't want to build a little bit more muscle? You don't want to do accessory work that would be, be positive when it comes to muscle, the amount of muscle that you build? For someone that cares about aesthetics or cares about maximizing the muscular potential, then how do they synthesize this all these great data points that you went over and the entire context of what you just said?
Yeah, really it comes down to a philosophical change from how you view your training. Of, like you said, is the goal to be a masochist? Is the goal to work hard? Or is the goal to be effective? And they overlap a lot, so it's very difficult. I understand. This is one of those correlations that is a pretty strong one, and it's going to work out most of the time. If you just train hard, unless you get way out in left field, you're probably going to be okay. And it is also, there's some context. This is where it's helpful to understand the mechanism. So it's not just like compounds. You have to think about like what's What's really, really fatiguing? What generates a whole lot of fatigue? It has to do with like how much muscle mass there is and how much total fatigue you're inducing. So there's a study by Rossman and colleagues back in 2014 where they had people do leg extensions to failure on one leg or two legs. And then they looked at how much peripheral fatigue was accumulated. And they were able to accumulate more peripheral fatigue, more local fatigue, doing a single leg extension to failure than two, because one is twice the muscle mass. So essentially the whole concept is the central governor is like, man, they're generating a whole bunch of fatigue in these large muscles. Now it's dual leg. I'm not going to let them push that hard. The experience, though, is that you're going to failure on a bilateral leg extension. But why did you hit failure, right? This is where you have to think about being effective versus being hard. Both feel hard. You do single leg and the other leg. But if the lights are not fully turned on when you're doing something that is really, really hard because you're using a lot of muscle mass, that's not going to be as effective. You're holding yourself back quite literally. When in reality, we want to induce that stimulus. So I think understanding that the mechanism is important. And if this is an extrapolation again, but if we take the findings from McKendry 2014, showing that, bilateral leg extensions to failure with produces a little bit less local fatigue, which we want, again, maybe that explains, if we go back to that study on muscle protein synthesis, why we saw a lower MPS response to someone doing short versus longer rest intervals when they did the leg extensions and leg press. So, okay, things are starting to connect now. If I am not able to recruit and train this muscle, therefore it's not going to get attention stimulus, therefore I'm not going to see an increase in MPS, therefore I'll not grow as much. That explains Schoenfeld from back in the day having this full body 3 times a week session and them only resting 1 minute and growing far less than 3 minutes. Okay, fair enough. So the question is then, okay, what do we do about it if we hold this to be true? And this is where I don't think there's much cost to being wrong because, it fits the data, right? So another thing I want to get back to, you were a personal trainer, I was a personal trainer. The advice to rest 5 minutes between sets just to be safe, really not useful because we have sometimes 30, 45, at best an hour with our client. Some of that's going to be them warming up because they never get there on time. Some of that's going to be you talking about their nutrition or their habits or their sleep. Some of that's going to be them going, oh, wait, I need to take a shower before I get to work. So in reality, you've got about 90% of the time you expect with that client, unless they're just a star, show up early, come to you warmed up, ready to go. The whole reason they're coming to a personal trainer is because they don't have all that shit on lock. So they often don't, at least initially. So I think a lot of personal trainers, they really need to find, and the people who are not with a personal trainer, but in the same situation as their clients, people with limited time, who are trying to exercise, what is optimal is not feasible. It's not helpful. And there are a lot of strategies out there where we can, if we know when and why and how short rest intervals can be debilitative and when and how and why they can be helpful, now we can start manipulating variables in a way that makes our training more efficient instead of just taking a less nuanced view, kind of default 5-minute rest intervals. Yeah, if you take 5-minute rest intervals, all this stuff, you don't even need to worry about it. And then you can just do the number of sets you need to do. Granted, if you took 2-minute rest intervals for hypertrophy, it would probably be just as good, and the workout would be less than 50% as long. And then, guess what you could do? Another set, And that's actually what a study by Ahtiainen and colleagues that came out of Finland back in, I think, 2005, is they matched volume between these two groups, one resting shorter, one resting longer, and they just did an extra set to match the volume, and the results were equivalent. So sure, maybe you're getting a little less efficiency per set by resting shorter, and maybe it's due to that central fatigue, and then that also resulting in less volume, right? But what if you just did more sets? And that's perfectly acceptable. And that's where the practical reality may not meet the data set of what's optimal. So there's absolutely nothing wrong with resting shorter on purpose or restricting your rest intervals to some degree, but it's not because of metabolic stress. It's a pathway to hypertrophy. It's not because, et cetera, et cetera. It is just this really simple cost-benefit analysis of if I lose a little bit of efficiency by not resting as long, I gain a little bit of time. What do I do with that time? If the answer is go, eat dinner with your kids, spend more time at work, manage your life, incorrect. The answer is do more sets always, and make sure that you neglect your family and job in search of having 1 extra centimeter of bicep growth every 3 years. So I think the cult understands that.
Yep.
But there's also other ways to do it, like antagonist paired sets. That's the example of doing like a row, not resting completely, and doing then a press. And because they're antagonist muscle groups, you shouldn't be experiencing nearly as much fatigue, at least locally, so you can perform well. And it may even have some priming effect. Another option is, okay, if I understand that restricted rest intervals are probably not a problem if it creates not much central fatigue or my experience of a global cardiometabolic fatigue, then I can reserve that stuff for my isolations and machine movements, and I can take a more traditional approach. So if I was to give someone like the most time-managed version of this, A, you need to be in decent shape, and then B, you can go through a full body workout. You can do a press and a pull. So let's say you got a squat, let's say you got a hip hinge, you got an upper body press, upper body pull, and then you've got some accessory stuff, right? Let's say that's your training session. Plain Jane vanilla approach on some of those full body movements. On your hip hinge and your squat, you rest as long until you need to feel able to perform again. You don't go to failure, and you produce some good work. Once you start getting to upper body press, upper body pull, we've got some good data that so long as you're in sufficient shape, might even enhance volume and enhance your strength gains. You alternate sets, resting just 30 to 60 seconds between. That's to mitigate global fatigue, global cardiometabolic fatigue, but knowing that you're getting sufficient rest, because essentially when you're pulling, your pressing muscles are resting. So you finish your press pull, then you get to arms. Absolutely feel free. You can run the rack, you can do your drop set, or you can do a rest pause and just do one set to failure or close to it, rest 20 to 30 seconds, and cluster until you're at a 9 or 10 RPE until you get 3 or 4 drops. And that would probably cut down on your workout time compared to just resting 3 minutes between all sets by at least 25%. And it should give you equivalent results. So that's a practical example of how to run this. And we're still learning more, but there's no reason to believe that any of that would be problematic. The data on antagonist paired sets is neutral or positive. The data on rest pause, at least for isolation movements, and the data on drop sets, at least for isolation movements, is again neutral or positive. So there's no downside here. And even the data on rest intervals for the strict goal of hypertrophy, you can actually drop them pretty low. I think all the way down to 2 minutes between even compound movements, you're probably doing okay. And any like loss of efficiency, again, can be made up by doing another set. Not that more volume is always better, but if you are trying to find time efficiency, doing 3 sets with 5-minute rests, that's at least 15 minutes plus the time to do them. Doing 4 sets with 2-minute rests, that's 8 minutes plus the time to do it. It's probably at least a 1/3 reduction in total time. And that's only adding 1 set. It's not like I would need to match the total amount of time and just do more and more sets because you might just overtrain.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of ways to square this circle and to come away with a low risk potential benefit of understanding the mechanism of this stuff.
I think that's something that, Eric, people tend to forget when they chase that phrase optimal, like what is best. It's actually what is best for you in particular, where the idea that every individual has the luxury of time to give, you hear on Instagram, individuals, my 3-hour training session. I'm like, you're what in the what now? It's like, and how many times do you train per week? You train, 5 times per week. So you're at the gym for 15 hours in total, getting after your goal. And that might be perfect for you in the context of everything else. But as you just said, antagonistic pairing right now, let's say if we could hypothetically cut 25% of your training time and you would experience no detriment to your hypertrophy goals. Okay, so let's say we train, I don't know, like 2 hours, 2.5 hours in change, and we do just some of these combinations that yield, us training for less time. It's like you save 30 minutes. Let's say you train 5 hours per week. Man, that's 2.5 hours per week. Now per month, we're saving 10 hours. That instrument you wanted to pick up, chaboy, now it's up to you. I think almost people, it's comfortable. And for many people, it is kind of the place one meditates, where you go to the gym and like you're in your zone and you're in your space. And I actually think that a lot of people in this new wave where they incorporate strength, it's fun. Like it kind of in between sets, they're listening to their music. You know what I mean, Eric? Like you do a top set of bench, you do it, you're chilling 3 to 4 minutes. It's like you're working out, yes, and you're definitely achieving your goal, but it's kind of like me time, if that makes sense. And so that's a consideration. But if you, and as you stated, I think the Iron Cult will recognize this as you get more and more responsibilities in life. It's like, oh shit, I'm now not just a student. I have a job. Now I have a significant other. Oh, I'm married. I have children. I have this. I have that. It's like I have all these different considerations. Now it's just not about me time. It's like, how do I go best about my workout or organizing my training with some of these variables to achieve the result I want given the time context? And I think that is very important because oftentimes we'll be sold the idea of optimal. Like, oh, you want to do something like, here's what you got to do. And it's like, Eric's like, wait a second. There's multiple pathways to success here. And if people were listening and they thought to themselves, so the answer is to have no responsibility so you can do whatever you want. That was one of the undercurrent themes of Iron Culture. You read correctly, Aleister Crowley, do what thou willst.
Nailed it. Yeah, you said pick up an instrument. My thought would be you could spend the time reading these studies that I told you about, or tracking your macros more precisely.
Yep.
Taking a nap to enhance recovery.
Yeah.
Researching supplements.
Yep.
Reading the muscle and strength pyramids, which you can find at www.muscleandstrengthpyramids.com. Researching what the best pair of shoes to get for Olympic lifting or anything are. Yeah. Checking out, position shoes. They're great. And you
should
it's
just
an opportunity to give us money.
Yeah, Eric, and they should just, as a side note, if you want to continue to educate and inform yourself and weed through the madness, because let's face it, you don't have time every month. There's probably, a couple hundred studies published. If you want individuals in the know to tell you what's up and for them to actually synthesize it for you so you can better understand it and it's more digestible. I heard there's something called MASS. I don't know, monthly applications of strength sports. I may have heard of this little thing. I heard there's a guy who, Eric, I'm going to shock you. He has your same name, and he's prolific on that thing.
It's a similar name. It's Derek.
Oh.
Or is it Aaron? Anyway, Dr. Trexler.
Yeah.
Good guy. Smart guy.
Is he a good guy?
Solid guy. You compare him on a scale of, anybody up to me. Yep. He's definitely in the anybody category. Right. But, not everybody can be me. From what I've heard, it's just me. So,
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
But he's a good dude. Yeah, good dude.
Yeah, I haven't really heard anyone say that, but it's nice that you're kind of vouching for someone you don't know. I think that's very noble of you. Yeah.
Yeah, I keep thinking I don't know him, and then I realize, that's just the same guy I interact with on a weekly, if not almost daily basis. I'm like, oh yeah, this guy again.
Eric.
Hey man, it's funny. He has to introduce himself every time he talks to me, which I imagine is tiring for him, but I also think it's probably a big honor for him to send me a message.
Yeah. Eric, it's just one of those things. You ever encounter someone that's just so forgettable? You've heard someone being so unforgettable, but someone's just so forgettable, your mind just thinks to itself subconsciously like, I don't need to store this information.
Well, there's important things we have to store in this life, like grams of protein estimated that I ate today.
Right.
I don't have room to remember whether your name is Aaron or Derek. So I just think people need to have realistic expectations. We've all got important stuff to do in our life. Like you play guitar. Yeah. I, want to think about anything besides what this guy's real name is.
Right.
It's complicated. Yeah. It's complicated stuff. So, yeah.
And he keeps offering it. But, Eric, I guess if you could do everyone the solid then, you kind of answered the question. You wrapped it all neatly. You went back all the way to the starting point, and now we're close to reaching the ending point. What would you like to conclude with when it comes to rest intervals? And that's where the person, I love when the reductionist mindset, where someone will hear something, it's like, so cardio doesn't matter. It's like, no, if you want to simplify, you want to store that bite-sized piece of information in your brain, and you want to simplify it to a point where there's a major loss of fidelity. Do you, bro? If you actually want to know in the greater context how all these things fit in, what would you say?
That's actually a good one. So I think it's really important to, don't come away with this with, isolation movements, I'm allowed to do this stuff. Compounds, I'm not. It really comes down to whether or not you're inducing a ton of global cardiometabolic fatigue. And that's going to be individual. So 2 studies I alluded to, but I didn't mention, I think they're both by D'Souza. They actually compared tapering rest intervals down over the course of a study compared to just a fixed period of rest. And I want to say in both of them, they compared like 2 minutes of rest versus doing like 15 or 30-second drops per week. So eventually they were comparing a 2-minute rest versus a 30-second rest. And there was actually a non-significant difference in hypertrophy. So it seemed quite similar. So this is the idea that, it hurts me to say it, I'm going to say it, you want to get in better cardiovascular shape to some degree as a lifter. And this is why we almost discussed it during the cardio episode. We alluded to it. That's when you and I originally were talking about it, like, hey, what about this thing? And I'm not saying you need to do CrossFit. I'm absolutely not saying you need to go and do endurance training. And if anyone ever accuses me of that, you're going to be meeting my buddy D. Lennon. I'm not going to say his first names, and you'll be able to figure out who I'm talking about. I think we've disguised his identity sufficiently.
He has a weird tagline, Eric. He has a real weird tagline.
Absolutely. They won't figure it out. So anyway, being in poor shape means that you're going to experience, it's basically, how quickly can you handle fatigue? How quickly can you buffer? How quickly can you restore your local energy systems to be able to train again, right? So if you're in good enough shape, and I've definitely seen this, like when I came out of lockdown, because I had to do all this high rep training, and I was doing basically front squats and high rep, deadlifts, nothing was fatiguing me in the same way that it used to. I would experience the local burning and like, oh my God, I feel like they're on fire, but it was not like my lungs were the limiting factor anymore, or I would just poop out. And I had definitely experienced that in the past. And I was thinking, man, there is something to being at least mildly athletic. And I think that's supported by these two studies by D'Souza, where they saw that, actually the gains weren't that bad, but they didn't just go right to 30 seconds, which is essentially what all the other studies are doing. We're going to compare 3 minutes to 1 minute. And 1 minute, nobody rests 1 minute. Like it takes 30 seconds just to change the plates and then another 30 seconds to go get water. So even if you're with a workout partner and you guys change the plates, talk for a second, you and her or you and he, that you do your thing and then you swap and then you train. Like when I train that with my wife, I've measured it. It's at least 2 minutes most of the time if you guys are lifting different weights. So, that puts you into the range of what seems to be perfectly fine for at least the goal of hypertrophy. So that's something that they should take away, is that it's not just here are the new rules based on the new data. And yes, there will be a new guru in the future, but here's your current guru rules. It is, let's understand this, right? If we understand that this global fatigue can have a feedback effect and induce, central fatigue from that local fatigue, and that's not useful. Okay, what can we do to only induce local fatigue and minimize the amount of central fatigue we get? That's when it starts to make sense. Like, okay, I can do drop sets. I can look at that study by Prestes and I can understand why that happened. I can look at the study by Ozaki and I can understand why that happened. And you can use these tools to your advantage. So for the most part, how do you know if you're doing it right? Are you getting your ass kicked cardiovascularly? Does this feel like a hypertrophy session, or does this feel like a Metcon session with a barbell or cardio or weights or whatever? And I think this almost goes counter to what some bodybuilders do on leg day. And I think a lot of bodybuilders are probably getting an effective stimulus early on, and then later they're just kind of doing this extended cardio session. And of course, you will adapt to that over time. It'll get better and better. But I would challenge everyone to ask, like, okay, how do I set up my training? How should I manage the collection of variables that can influence this? Because it's not just rest periods. I had a lot of comments on this blog post, and some people were saying like, hey, it's, you mentioned that we should probably be doing moderate reps, not training to failure, and, only doing these failure techniques or intensity techniques on isolation movements. Doesn't that conflict with some of the modern popular and seemingly effective bodybuilding programs? Like there's some stuff out there in the more intensity dominant spectrum of the bodybuilding training philosophies where you do like 2 really hard sets to failure on squats, but you actually rest sufficiently between sets, and it's just 2 sets. Like how much fatigue do you think 2 sets of squats really can induce, even though you're going to failure? So that's not the same thing as doing sets of 12 on 3 sets per exercise of 6 compound movements in the same session. So this is why it's important to understand what I'm really getting at, and not to take one piece in isolation and go, oh, failure's bad. Oh, short rest periods are bad.
Yeah.
Oh, unless I do them in isolation movement. But really, what are we trying to do? Why do we give these rest intervals out as recommendations? It's to ensure that your energy systems have recovered so you can perform, right? So you don't need to clock your rest period. You can just assess internally, am I recovered? And I think that is something that is, almost goes back to our episode where we discussed quote unquote intuition with Dr. Fundero and Mike T, where, yeah, we have all these external metrics. We have all these external cues. We have biofeedback. We have apps. We have rest timers. We have all this stuff that we can use. But essentially, many of those metrics are stand-ins for the things we can know if we pay attention and are honest with ourselves. And that is the mark of, in my opinion, an advanced athlete, someone who can use their own signals as the principal guide of what they do, and then they are simply tracking data to see what correlates with it. Instead of saying, I must hit 250 grams of carbs, you're eating based on your hunger and satiety cues for your goals, maybe staying a little hungry or staying a little full if you're trying to do a mini cut or a bulk. And then you're seeing what that results in when you track calories. That is one informing the other versus the other informing this. So you can find out, am I getting in better shape? How would I know that? Well, I will go when I'm ready. And if that rest interval drops from 5 minutes when I was in terrible shape down to 2.5 minutes, wow, I'm recovering a lot better between sets. And I think that's important because I literally have seen, this is more common in the powerlifting community, people rest double-digit number of minutes between sets. And I don't mean equipped lifters who have that time to put on a shirt and all that stuff. Yeah. That's a whole logistical concern. But literally people on bench press just kind of sitting around waiting forever to go again. Yeah. Sometimes it's for social reasons. Sometimes it's because they're in that bad of shape. And I almost am worried that if it takes 10 minutes for your cardiovascular system to recover, okay, that's great. You rest an appropriate amount of time. But is the local musculature and joints, are they now need to be re-warmed up? Yeah. Like there's some logistical concerns I have here. Yeah. Are you actually ready to go back under that heavy ass weight? Yeah. So yeah, you've cooled off, locally, but maybe you're ready, more globally. The disconnect there is you're probably going to die at 45 of a heart attack. So like first principles first, come on, you're never going to be a Masters 2. I think you should get in decent enough shape to where you can go with 5 or 6 minutes of rest at the most between sets or something like that.
I'm thinking of that cultural meme of the individual saying 5 reps cardio. Am I right? I'm like, this is just sad. Honestly, you're getting winded. It's an RP7 set and you're getting winded from this. What's going on, man?
Yeah, I'm not mad if that was your 8th set of 5. Yeah, if you're banging out the volume, and well, I am probably mad because I don't know if you need to do 8 sets of 5. But if we've established you do, if you're in a high volume block, if you're a high performing lifter, and you can do 8 sets of 5 in 40 minutes, that's not bad. You know, that ain't bad at all. So, but yeah, if that was the first set and you're like, oh, cardio, I'm like, you did 5 at a 7 RPE, man. Come on.
Oh man, it's almost as if sometimes we attempt to define ourselves via negative, that which we're not. So an individual is like, I don't do cardio. It's therefore it's stupid. It's I'm a strength athlete. I'm like, as you said, Eric, it's you're a heart attack waiting to happen. I mean, if I've seen, and so. This is in the context, once again, it's just my buddy Mike, Silent Mike, where he interacted with a lot of individuals where I'm just going to say kind of untested big boys, thick boys. We're talking heavyweights and super heavyweights. We're talking people that they probably have problems walking through a doorway unless they go sideways. And even then, it's kind of someone has to push them from behind.
2 people, would you say that if they got in a boxing match, they would probably both die of a heart attack before either one landed a punch?
Yeah, I would say both of them would make 7 figures, but both are very likely to die. Along the way. Yeah.
So at the cost of 2 great strength athletes' death and maybe the legitimacy of our sport, at least they're making 7 figures that they can spend for the next year.
Yeah. Well, worth it. Their families hopefully will make do with that. Real quick about that before I make the joke about the thick boys is that Mike kind of said it correctly. Where I almost felt, Eric, and not trying to talk about controversial things, but it's like, it is this great man, 501 kilo deadlift. It's like, okay, now we're fighting now. It's like, this was a big win. This was a big win for the strength community. Like, holy shit, it's on ESPN. It's like that Canadian athlete, Jessica Boutner, when like it was put on ESPN, like deadlifting 550, you know, it's like, that's a big moment for strength sports. It's like, what do we do with it? So now we got the win. The spotlight's on this community. It's like, what we're going to do is like, and we're going to go over here and we're going to start doing some boxing. We have no experience doing this. I weigh 440 pounds. I probably shouldn't be doing this because I'm not used to training at all. I'm at severe risk.
Hey, it's just taking lessons from the great moral philosopher Don King. On how to advance our community. I don't think there's anything wrong with that.
No. And I do think when we talk about cardio, some of the people I've seen at the gym, some of them thick boys, where they'd be tying up their shoes and, you know, they're bending over it. Of course, they have to do it seated. They actually can't bend over because I think just they'll probably have a stroke, honestly. An AVM will go off, an arterioventricular malformation. Will just go off. But what I was
hey, can we give you the science award for today? That was pretty good.
Hey, look
at that acronym.
Look. Okay,
hanging.
If it's an acronym, here we go, boy. I was gonna say that that individual sitting on the bench. I don't know if you've seen this, Eric, but someone tied their shoe, stand up, and then like just from being in that kind of almost prone position to like going to a fully erect standing position, almost wins them. And I'm not even joking. I'm like, dude, you're done. Like, I don't know what's going on here, but this ain't fitness.
That's just not healthy. Yeah. Like, I mean, last time I checked, you can't lift weights if you're dead. So to some degree, to some minor degree, we do have to acknowledge that health is involved, at least to the point where we are alive to perform. Yeah. You know? I'm all good with saying, hey, I'm willing to make some reasonable, informed choice decisions about how far I'm going to push my body for performance and my goals at maybe small expenses to health. Yeah. But if you get the real short end of the stick where you're not alive to perform, I feel like maybe you need to rethink that balance. That's just me.
Yeah. And balance wouldn't even be the word for it. It's like, we're going all in. It's like the West Side documentary where we got these broken bodies and just this mindset like, Yeah, but Eric, I will say what's interesting about this conversation to close it up is that we've given some other considerations. You know, we are the iron culture that we care about getting maximum swole, but then in consideration of someone that they might not have unlimited time at the gym. You know, they might not be able to dedicate as much time as, you know, someone that has a much more time, someone that maybe, you know, you're in school, maybe you're out for the summer, you're out for the season, or maybe you have a flexible schedule. Maybe you're a lot of people that listen to this, they're personal trainers. Like, yeah, no shit, bro. Of course you could train a lot. It's like you're in the gym 24/7. So it's and I think the greater question, which was brilliant how you did it, is how does one organize their training best considering all the factors at hand? It's kind of also the sub conversation. So I would just ask you at this point, you already knocked it out of the park. You're already doing the grand slam kind of slow trot wave. Is there anything you want to say as you're doing the slow trot wave? Like just kind of that little like sexy shuffle where it's like, yeah, I know I'm the shit. You know, like you put a little swag in the step because it ain't about reaching the end destination under a clock. Because once again, rest intervals are junk. You're just taking your time and you're celebrating. So this is your moment.
Yeah, this is basically back when the win in the 100-meter sprint that Usain Bolt had, where he started celebrating before he hit the line, became a cultural meme. Yeah. And like for 20 seconds, he's taking pictures and getting the flowers and popping champagne while the other guys are still in the middle of the race. And actually, so is he. He's just that fast. Yep. So I appreciate that. That's a very accurate representation of what we're going to do now. Yep. So no, but seriously, there's actually one more thing I do want to say because I think. Being the hashtag evidence-based folks we are, we like numbers, we like data, we like tracking, and we like seeing how do I compare week to week to week to ensure that I am improving. And I commend you for that. One thing that I didn't cover that I think is important is, okay, let's say you're currently utilizing that kind of safe bet, but maybe not efficient use of time of I do my curls, or my isolation movements or my non-fatiguing big lifts the same way I do my big lifts. I rest 3 minutes between sets. I don't go to failure. And now you're telling me, okay, failure's okay, and also 30-second rest periods are okay, or even running the rack is okay and lateral raises. Oh my God. Well, how do I compare that to my traditional training? If next week I'm going to do drop sets, or if next week I'm going to do rest pause. And my advice is clean the slate, because we don't actually have good data on that. So I kind of talked about these two studies almost in conjunction, but to be real clear, that Ozaki study was on drop sets. And what they specifically did was they had a group that did 80% of 1RM with drop sets down to, I think, 65, 50, 40, and 30, versus another group that just did 3 sets of 80%. And I think these were bicep curls. And the drop set group performed quite well, and I believe they were, I think they induced a similar amount of cross-sectional area. So, okay, you want to do that. You want to save some time. How do you compare these drop sets? The answer is you don't. I think probably 4 or 5 drop sets would be equivalent to 3 hard sets, something like that. And, including the activation sets, you might need to do like 1 more drop than the total sets you did before. But from that point on, I would only compare like to like. So let's say, for example, you're doing curls. You do a set of 40, then you go down to 30, then you do 20, then you do a set of 15s. And you used to do just 3 sets of 40. So now you do the first set to failure. You immediately go to failure on those next weights. Next week, use the same weights and just try to add reps. And that's the way you would progress from there. Don't try to make a comparison, because we honestly don't know, and that kind of detail is probably not necessary. And the same thing I would recommend for the rest pause. So that rest pause study, that was done by Prestes and colleagues, and same kind of thing. That's the one where they did 3 sets of 6 at 80% versus a set to failure and then clusters. Once you start doing that, as we can tell, it doesn't match up, right? So 1 set of 10 to 12 and then clusters until you hit a total of 18 reps outperformed 18 reps as a 3x6. So again, don't make the comparison. If you want to start doing that with some of your less fatiguing movements, go for it. That's fine. Do maybe, let's say, 3 rest pauses, similarly to it where you do three drops. And I think that's kind of a good starting point, and it's equivalent of like 1 main set, 3 mini sets versus 3 moderate sets. I think that's a great place to start, and then just compare like to like. Okay, so that first set, your activation set, you got 12 reps this time. Set a cap. Once I can do more than 12, I go up and load, and then I start fresh again. But until I hit 12 on that first activation set, I'm just going to work on adding reps in my back offs and getting more in that activation set. So let's say week 1, you do like 10, 6, 4, 3. Next week, you're going to get 11, 7, 5, 4. And then eventually, once you hit 12, then you can increase the load. So it can be this kind of natural within comparison progression rather than trying to compare it to straight sets, because they don't compare. So the last thing I want to say is just the progression over time. If you want to make the swap over, clean the slate, and again, just keep it on movements that you think are going to produce a low amount of global fatigue.
Eric, I have one question for you, and that is, are you ever afraid?
Fear is the mind killer, so I am afraid, but I try to keep it at bay when I need my mind to not be killed.
So the reason I ask that is because you're giving all these major keys to everyone listening, and directly probably, we got a lot of bodybuilders listening. So those that look up to you that are, let's face it, your competitors, and I know what's happening. 2019, you were the River City Royal Rumble champion. Someone's going to use all this great information. And Eric, here's the negative part, bro. They're going to get better. Okay? So now you're making the competition better. So when I asked you, are you afraid of giving all of this information for free to your potential competitors? It's tough, man.
You're well, as we know, it is a zero-sum game.
Yeah.
There's only so many gains to go around.
Yeah.
And as the great saying, a high tide raises your ship and sinks everyone else's. Yeah. I'm pretty sure I'm accurately stating that.
Yeah.
So there are things. I mean, I can't be purely altruistic.
No.
Okay. There are things I'm going to do which probably don't belong on Iron Culture.
Sure.
When the chips are down, when it's needed, when I'm the man, or will be the man because of my actions in the back pump up room. You're thinking, hey, that's Eric Helms. He's the guy. He's the reason I started doing drop sets in my lateral raises. And man, I've been juicy because of that. I'm aware of that. And unfortunately, you chose the wrong show. So when you look down and you find, where did my bands go? where did my sodium go that he suggested I take before I get on stage to increase blood pressure to get a pump? Heck, where did my shirt go? Yeah. What is this, pumping iron? And you look over at me, and I have a shirt that says Arnold numero uno, except I've crossed out Arnold, and I said Helms. I'm not saying I took your shirt and your sodium and your bands, and also knifed the tires of your car, so that you can't try to chase after me to get the trophy that should have been yours, but it's now mine.
Yeah.
But let's just say, I told you so.
Yeah. So you're giving them the keys, but you're not giving them the treasure. You're keeping it locked in your heart. And I understand that, Eric. And that is the mark, honestly, my friend, of a true competitor. So I think you've helped a lot of people. But, as someone classically said, if you come at the king, you best not miss. And so people are put on notice now. And they're at least they're aware, because once again, by these hands do you sow your own fate. When they see what happens before them, and you've told them, once again, you've actually given them now the pretext of what's about to happen, they shouldn't be shocked. It actually is more like a Greek tragedy where the fates, the three fates, it was foretold already well in advance. So as it's happening to you, you should reflect. Hubris, pride before the fall.
Honestly, this reminds me of a real person who, when I was in the Air Force, he gave us an introduction about how he runs his ship.
Yep.
His name was, I think, Captain, it was like Gansta or something like that, Ganister. But after this presentation, we would only call him Captain Gangster,
right,
because of what he said. And one of the things he specifically said is, I run a tight ship. Here's the way I do things. Here are the expectations. So if you mess up, the good news is, I'll never stab you in the back. I'll stab you in the chest. And he made eye contact with each one of us. And that was when he became Captain Gangsta. He put us all on notice. Yeah. There was no reason to expect that any of us would be bad airmen, not do our job. Yeah. But he let us know that he would stab us in the chest if necessary from the start. So none of us expected anything different.
That's what we do here, okay? Listen, guys, we put you on notice. We inform you. We wish for the best. But if you see us on the streets, you know what's up. Eric, let me ask you this, my man. This has been another clinic, and I think this will be another episode where people reflect upon it, where it's like, I thought I knew the answer, but now I actually know the answer in quotations, #science, and I know how to apply for myself. Where can people find you?
You could find me right here with you.
No.
All the time.
Damn.
Yes.
Bro, I'm hyped. Okay, I was just waiting for that commitment. I love to hear it. I mean, I know it's a commitment, but when we're together for eternity, sometimes you just gotta let it ring in your ears. You know what I'm saying?
Yep, you want to check in, and even if I'd said, I'm really not feeling this, you'd be like, well, that's what you signed up for. It's eternity. You don't get a choice. And I go, okay, I'll move on to the phase of acceptance.
Yeah, it's a legally binding contract from here to forever. And I'm glad you're on board. Because whether or not you're glad is inconsequential, because you're here with me. I want to just shout out Eric. I will make sure for this episode that I leave linked in the description the article with which everything that was discussed is from. You can certainly check that out. I mean, you should already be following Eric on the Instagrams. You can help us out on Iron Culture by leaving us a rating and review on iTunes, because right now, we are doing that battle, and there are numerous other shows, that are popping up that is usually sex with someone. And so there might be a major announcement in Iron Culture's future about us signaling a change, a branding change. I won't allude to what it says, but needless to say, it'll be a very strong new title that we think will rank very well. So leave us a rating review on YouTube. Go ahead and leave us a comment. We'll do our best to respond, and we'll catch everyone from now until eternity every single Monday.